So last week we covered what was then the upcoming first round of Colombia's presidential election, so we wanted to offer an update on how it went. Now, to refresh your memory, the race pitted Gustavo Petro, a former leftist rebel, against Federico Gutierrez, the choice of the conservative establishment, and Rodolfo Hernandez, who was running as something of a Colombian Trump-like figure. He's a wealthy businessman and populist who has politics that don't fit neatly into a box. He speaks his mind. He doesn't care about political correctness. You get the gist. So he self-financed a run for mayor previously of Bucaramanga and had a colorful tenure there, even getting himself suspended for this. And when you watch this, be aware this may be the next president of Colombia.
Este señor socio de Freya Anaya en el entorno oeste.
Sí,
socio.
Eso no sabe la gente.
¿Y quién es Freya Anaya?
¿Qué?
No fue su hijo, no fue su hijo miembro de la
¡Mientes! ¡No es así! ¿Cuándo? ¿Dijo qué dijo? ¿Qué dijo? ¿Por qué eso?
My Spanish is rusty, but I think what he's saying is your fedora is horrible.
Take it off.
Yeah, take it off, and he refused.
Take this fedora off. So Petro had been hoping for a first round knockout because he was worried that the elite would consolidate in the second round. And so after the first round, though, he fell short. There were a lot of charges of vote rigging. In fact, the monitors said they couldn't certify the results because they couldn't get access to the software.
Yeah.
So Petro was credited with winning 40% of the vote. A lot of his supporters think he won more than 50%, but he was credited with 40%, while Rodolfo won 28%, taking second place. With nobody getting 50%, it goes to a June 19th runoff. So most international news outlets called this a shock, a surprise result, but it's actually what our guest last week, Jimenez Sanchez, had been predicting. Gutierrez, meanwhile, the establishment candidate, immediately endorsed Rodolfo. And then this is the interesting dynamic that I wanted to ask you about, because we're in a place now where I think for the last 50 years or so, you couldn't really watch a lot of politics around the world and draw lessons from them that apply to the United States. Mm-hmm. But something about the world is changing in a way that you can now. Like, you can start to see these parallels. You have these Trump figures all over the place. And it's interesting that, to me, that, and maybe it shouldn't be, maybe it should be obvious, that immediately what you would call the Republican establishment, the conservative kind of business elite Jeb Bush types down in Colombia, and actually friends with Jeb Bush, because Jeb Bush from South Miami, has a lot of links to these movements.
You can just say Jeb.
Jeb.
Yeah.
Jeb.
Jeb.
You need 2 exclamation points, one on each side.
Yes.
They immediately endorse Rodolfo. Mm-hmm. So they're like, there's not a second of hesitation before the whole kind of establishment wing is like, all right, we're with the Trump guy, who like Trump has some unorthodox politics. Like, he wants to like normalize relations with Venezuela, mm-hmm. Which is the conservative establishment in Colombia would that's anathema to them. They think that's insane. But do you think that there is enough of an overlap between this right-wing populism and conservative establishmentarian politics that it's a natural alliance, or are they just so scared of a former rebel running the country that they'll just take whoever they can?
Right, it's that. I think it's the Cold War mentality, and the right has been in a Cold War mentality since the Cold War, right? Like, it hasn't really ever gone away. We're seeing that sort of change with the Ukrainian conflict right now, but it's very much this reflexive support or opposition, as you say, against, and we talked about this last week in the context of a potential pink wave. At the same time, though, I mean, AMLO had a pretty interesting posture towards Trump, and there was an interesting dynamic there. So I don't know where this plays out, but you're getting at something really interesting about the way globalization and social media has created archetypes and has elevated American archetypes into like roles people play now in international politics. And obviously there was Ross Perot before there was Donald Trump. But there's something about, you could even look at like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or Obama. There's just this congealing of different roles that people look at, and it makes sense. The populism.
And for people who don't know, AMLO's the Lopez Obrador, the Mexican kind of leftist populist president who also unorthodox, and also in a populist sense, the kind of liberal establishment there hated his COVID policies. He was very Trumpian, kind of aligned very Trumpian, what you would call based with how he approached COVID. Then you've got, what's his name, Castillo in Peru, the cowboy, but who has been really, who has kind of been neutered by the right down there, but won as a leftist. And then you've got Boric, the socialist who won in Chile.
But on the other hand, you have Nicaragua, and now you have Colombia going in interesting directions, leftist populism.
Yep, and then you've got that weird Bitcoin guy in El Salvador who's like rounding up half the country. But
another example of like, he's very much his own, like that is a unique role, right? But I do think like taking some from different, like when you see how populism works and you see how sort of globalization has flattened the global culture in different ways, Bitcoin is a really good example that like you tap into that, there's a political logic to it. That translates in some cases.
Turned out not to be a financial logic, and it didn't work out well for El Salvador.
It sure didn't.
No, and then in Brazil, you've got the populist Bolsonaro, or the left populist Lula might be the only thing that can counter the kind of right populism of Bolsonaro. There's something about parties and institutions that people are just not into anymore. Like they don't want their relationship with politicians to be mediated by parties. They just want a direct connection with the politician. And actually that dude that you saw slap the guy on the fedora, Rodolfo, like they call him the TikTok king. Like his entire campaign was basically on TikTok.
Right.
And that was it. Like, and they say he came from out of nowhere because he surged in the last several weeks to take out the kind of right-wing establishment guy. But yet just on TikTok, and that's a way to make that direct connection. Like people just feel that they know the guy. The way that you feel like you know Trump, like Trump, all of his pathologies are just right there on the surface. Like everybody knows like where he's like. When you read one of his statements, you can hear him saying it.
Yes, and I want to be clear, I'm not saying this is top-down, like the United States is reinventing politics and everyone is just copying what's happening here because we're just the most important. That's not what I mean, but what I mean is that there are similar causes, there are similar promptings for populism around the world that you see happening in different ways, and people are taking advantage of that, and it is being injected into politics in similar ways. Donald Trump is the most high-profile example, obviously, of somebody realized that he could use free media on Twitter. He could get he saw that happening. Other people have seen it happen too, but it's just the most high-profile example that we have, and it's one that we see being replicated in different places in interesting ways. And AMLO, to me, is a really good example of how unorthodox this leftist and even right-wing populism is in Latin America, which people may sort of like realize, well, why do I care what's happening in a Colombian election? Why do I care if they want to normalize relationships with Venezuela? Why do I care what's happening in Nicaragua? Well, we see how this affects policy all around the world. We see how this affects basically everything. And so the trends there are extremely important.
Yeah, people often say that Brazil is 10 years ahead of the U.S. in those trends. So we'll see. Early polls have Rodolfo Hernandez up by like 10 or 15 points, with the right consolidating around him against Petro. So we'll see. June 19th is when that election comes out.
Well, we'll keep covering it here.
We will indeed. That's it for Rising Fridays. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss anything. Check us out. We have a podcast too.
Yeah.
And if that's how you want to listen. But anyway.
If you're back to commuting, you're driving, and you want a podcast. By the way, I did not realize until I sat down in front of the camera this morning that I forgot to iron my shirt. So tune in next week to see if I remember to iron my shirt.
If you have it on HD, you can be able to see. Yeah.
I'm not optimistic that I'll remember to iron the shirt.
But on the podcast, you would never know.
Yeah, you know what? That's a really good point, Ryan. So if you're listening to the podcast, just ignore everything I just said and pretend you're listening to the voice of a perfectly ironed shirt, a person wearing a perfectly ironed shirt. Yeah.
Have a great weekend, and we'll see you next week.
See you, everyone.